Yeah, we wouldn't want any more anyway.
So thank you for joining Marianne and the professor. I am delighted to be joined by Gary Craigs, who is a native of Ottawa, Canadian Christian history buff, world history teacher, graduate of a master's in history with a specific interest in intellectual history. Is that right? The history of ideas, kind of including
Yeah.
culture and such. So that's kind of your area of expertise and interest, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
One little side note. I'm originally from New Brunswick, but I've lived in Ottawa. I first came here in 1993 and then left after a while, came back in 98. So I've spent almost as much time in Ottawa as New Brunswick. And I lived in Alberta for 10 years too.
Oh, okay. So but right now you're on the other edge of Canada. I'm sitting
Yeah.
out here in BC drinking. It's kind of almost comical. No boats on Sunday, which is a Kelowna cider that I'm drinking right now. So excuse me while I sip on that. We're having a very warm day out here in the West. So Gary, we've had some interesting conversation over the last few months about the state of the world right now from a Christian perspective. Where are we today? What is going on?
Well, that's a that's the $64,000 question now, isn't it? Do we have to update the 64,000 for today's economy? Uh, there are so many answers to that question. It's hard to know where to begin. There's so many things that have come together. Are you familiar with Bruce Pardy, the law prof from Queens?
Mhm.
He had a good article the other day talking about all the influences that are having an impact on our world today. And there's you know cultural Marxism and postmodernism, deconstructionism, and they are very difficult to pin down. As he said, I heard someone else make this comment recently. It's like trying to nail jelly to the wall. It's it's really difficult. So uh, you could talk about these various things, and the very nature of these, shall we say, trends in thought or ideologies, whatever you want to call them, say that because they are sort of lucid, it's difficult to nail them down. That they sort of, I don't know if the word corporately would be a good word to use, but as a body of ideas have been moving the West further and further to the left. And there's been a lot of modifications. We go back to Marxism, Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital, whatever you want to look at for Marx, has been modified quite a bit since Marx first wrote in the mid 1800s. And then there was the Frankfurt School that came along and saying, like, why is it that communism is not succeeding the way we thought it would? So there have been various people that have had an impact, and one of them was Herbert Marcuse, and he had a very prominent role to play in how everybody's being treated these days. Like, if you're on the left of the spectrum in politics, you get special treatment. If you are on the right, you're conservative, we have to shut you down. Like, you're bad because you're preventing, the ushering in of the coming utopia. And so conservatives are labeled far right. So that's like a pejorative to try to shut us down. Oh, they're evil, they're far right.
Mhm.
And it's very difficult for conservatives to get a word in. And this has ramped up dramatically in the last decade or so, and especially since the pandemic blew into town. And we're seeing so many aspects. One of my big concerns is that it's affecting society as a whole, but it's also been creeping into the church. And, the church is supposed to be the salt and light of the earth, but we have been seeing these secular ideas creeping into the church, especially over the last maybe 5 years, but it's been going on for decades, really. But I think we can look at, go back to the Cold War. And when the Soviet Union was our adversary, we always in the West have thought of the the big danger was, the Soviet military machine, and, the submarines and the nuclear weapons as the big threat. But really, the Soviet focus was to undermine us from within. They wanted to destroy us ideologically. Why have all these weapons when you could just so much more easily just destroy the culture from within? And so people came over here and insinuated themselves into our institutions, professors, you name it. But they also sent people to infiltrate the seminaries here in the West so as to undermine the churches from within. And that is really coming to fruition now. If we look at the Catholic Church in South America, because there was, I forget which pope it was that really incensed the Soviets, but back in probably the 60s, maybe even earlier, they got communists into the seminaries. And when you look at South America, I think it might have been Venezuela, I could have the wrong country, but they infiltrated the seminaries. And this is where we got I'm forgetting the term I'm looking for, uh, where Christ is pictured with an AK-47, and I forgot the term right now.
That's very disturbing. That that the church has been infiltrated, but it does feel now that we are definitely in a spiritual battle, and yet
Yes,
the Christians, for the most part, and the church are silent. Why?
yes.
Why?
Well, as we've discussed before, pietism is certainly part of the problem, and this came about a century after the Protestant Reformation, influenced by the 30 Years' War. I just did a little research since we last chatted to get a little more background. As I was telling you that I'm not totally familiar with all the ins and outs of pietism, but uh, there was a German, was it Philip Spener, Spener? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly. He was part of the original impetus for this, but then there was this Count Zinzendorf who kind of brought some of these people in under his wing, and just did some research earlier today where the Lutheran Church was actually quite hostile to this pietism. There was kind of a battle going on. There are many good things to say about pietism, but one of the key things that is not good is that it would advocate that Christians just bow out of the political arena. Let's just focus on our own personal spiritual growth, which is a good thing in and of itself. But when you start excluding Christian involvement in the political realm, well, that's contrary to what we are taught from Scripture. We need to be the salt and light of the earth. We need to take a stand. And as we were discussing earlier, people like William Wilberforce, who devoted 3 decades of his life to the abolition of the slave trade initially, and then eventually slavery itself. And it basically, I think it was around 1830 where it was finally outlawed in Britain. And this is an impetus from a Christian, and he belonged to this group known as the Clapham sect, and they were mocked and ridiculed. But and people told Wilberforce, "Oh, just stay out of this. Like, it's none of your business. Like, just go off and do your holy Christian things." But Wilberforce said, "No, like, this is what I, as a Christian, need to do." So that was a prime example of a Christian who was having a major influence in politics, and he was a good friend of Britain's prime minister. They were, close, and Wilberforce was hugely popular. Everybody loved him. Then we can look at Dietrich Bonhoeffer in the 20s and 30s, who saw what was going on with the rise of Hitler and the Nazis, and he tried to warn Germans about this danger, but everybody just poo-pooed him, like, oh, like, just, like, don't get, like, you're just going over the top here. This is, not the big problem that you seem to think it is. Well, Look where
How
that got us.
how did they how did the people of the day, the Germans of the day, dismiss Bonhoeffer? I've heard people say, even family members say, well, his approach was not right. What are they referring to? That Christians of the day would have criticized him when he was sounding the alarm with Nazism and Hitler.
I think partly the problem was pietism in Germany. That, like, don't get involved in politics. That was, I think, an element of it. Uh, have you read Eric Metaxas? Okay, he wrote a biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which I have not read, but a few months ago I purchased his latest book, A Letter to the American Church, where he is trying to wake up Americans, and he's telling them that, from his research on Bonhoeffer himself, he realized we're seeing the very same things going on, and he's writing from an American perspective, but it applies to Canada just as well. That the same sort of things that were happening under the Hitler and the Nazis are now happening again, but the church doesn't want to believe this. They just want to put their heads down, and it's like, oh no, yeah, maybe there's a couple of things, but it's not that big a problem. But Eric Metaxas is saying it's just the same as what Bonhoeffer was warning the church about. And Metaxas said that there were something like, I think, 18,000 Protestant pastors in Germany at the time. Don't know how many Catholic priests there were, but in reference to the Lutheran Church, Metaxas said that out of those 18,000, about 3,000 were staunchly opposed to Hitler and the Nazis. About 3,000 were fully supportive of Hitler and the Nazis. They had the swastika hanging in the churches. And in between was the other 12,000. And Metaxas said, what did they do? Nothing. It's like, here, I see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. It's not going on. And Metaxas is saying that's what's happening in America right now. And I think we can apply this equally to Canada, that no one wants to admit that something evil is going on or anything untoward, but it is. And as I was saying to you earlier, I think we've had it so good here in Canada for so long. Yes, we have had involvement in the First and Second World Wars, and we participated in the Cold War, but it was not on our own soil. Mm-hmm. So there's this attitude that, oh, well, those things that happened, like that was long ago, it can't happen again. And it certainly can't happen here. And that applies not just to the world wars, but look at Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago, Soviet dissident, and he estimated that from the beginning of the Russian Revolution until he secretly got his book published, I think in the 1960s or 70s, the Gulag Archipelago, much of which he wrote while he was in the Gulag himself. He estimated that the Soviet Union had exterminated 60 million of its own citizens in the name of communism. Some people think those numbers are too high, but even the most conservative estimates will admit to 20 million. And then there was the Black Book of Communism, which I think it was some French scholars, I could be wrong in that. They had fairly high numbers too, but lower than Solzhenitsyn. But this attitude that it can't happen here. And then we can look at China. The numbers there are even worse. Estimates go as high as 80 to 100 million people that died under Chairman Mao. And then there was the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, lasted for about maybe a decade, I think. And what was going on there is also going on right now. I think we're heading rapidly towards the situation where we're going to have the Red Guards. When you see some of the legislation that Trudeau is trying to pass right now, it's frightening. And I've talked to people. Well over 10 years ago, I met a Chinese woman who lived through the Cultural Revolution, and she told me every horror story you have ever heard about the Cultural Revolution is true. She said, I know because I lived through it. She said she was a little girl. Her parents were going to be, um, the Red Guards were coming after them. So that her parents took her to some friends and said, pretend that she's your daughter, raise her as your own. So they did. She never saw her parents again. That was it. And she said that she used to see this man that the Red Guards would beat every day on a regular basis, and his wife was begging him, please stop, and it went on for a long period of time. Finally, his wife one day ran to a nearby river, jumped in and drowned herself. She couldn't take it anymore. So I asked this woman, I said, I read this story once where you could get accused of some kind of failure to support the revolution, and you'd be surrounded by Red Guards, and one of them would take out a knife and stick it in and cut out your heart while you're standing there, and then take the heart and cut it up in little pieces and pass it around to everybody that's surrounding this person. If you did not eat a piece of this live heart, you would be next. I said, did that sort of thing happen? She said, yes, it did. But we think, oh no, that could never happen here.
Yes, yes.
But what's the problem? Why can we not believe that the evil that has taken place in other parts of the world could also happen here? What is it about the church that we seem to be oblivious to human nature? Do we think that human nature is basically good? I don't think that's what the Christian Bible tells us. The Bible's full of horror stories of the evil that goes on. Yeah, God talking in the Old Testament about those people that sacrifice their children to Moloch. Like, that can't happen anymore. Oh, that was back then. Like, that's never going to happen again. How do we get into this mindset where, oh, well, this is Canada. Such evil things cannot happen here. And we've lived such a wonderful life here for decades. I mean, ever since Canada started, there's been some problems, but this is human nature.
Mhm.
So how does the church pretend that there's not anything untoward going on right now? And there are certain things that you can see, well, okay, maybe some people might find this a little hard to believe, like nefarious things being done by the World Economic Forum or the World Health Organization, or pick any other thing. But what about what's going on in our education system, where it's you and your own children, or your friends and neighbors' children are being indoctrinated into all this pride ideology? How can you ignore that? And how can the church sit idly by and just, my lips are sealed?
Yeah, and this is what I'm flabbergasted with. There's kind of two problems going on. There's either uh, a corruption that is within some churches that agreed to become, for instance, vaccine centers. They took massive millions of dollars from the government to convert their churches into vaccine centers. So there's
Yes.
that blatant corruption. Then there's other churches that say, shh, don't stir the what, don't upset the apple cart. We don't want to rattle anyone. We don't want to offend anyone. And the leadership of the church will not even speak out against whether or not the vaccine is a good or bad thing. They say, well, it's up to everyone. Well, the scientists are clearly telling us that this is a toxic injection that is meant to kill. Why shouldn't the churches be outspoken in speaking truth? But most of the churches that I'm familiar with are either saying nothing or refuse to impart this information to the congregation, as though it's too controversial. We can't touch it. And so there's very, very few churches that are facing the evil front and center, talking about it from the pulpit, and giving very clear direction to the congregation as to how to navigate.
Yes.
Would you agree?
Yeah.
I don't even know in the Lower Mainland, in the Vancouver area, which churches are taking a hard stand against what's going on here. If there are one or two, I'm not familiar with them. I think there is one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think they exist, but I'm absolutely flabbergasted with the state of affairs in the Canadian church.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole other layer of Christians. Where are the Christians? Where are the Christian heroes of today? We've got plenty of
Yeah.
examples of them in history or in the Bible.
Yeah.
But where are the current Christian characters, solid Christian characters who are boldly speaking truth?
Yeah. I know of about maybe a dozen Christians who are on the same page as we are here in Ottawa. And I recently was put in touch with someone who said that in his own church that it's about the same. He knows about a dozen people who are on the same page as we are. And this goes back to when we look at the Freedom Convoy. I knew some Christians who went down and were quite supportive. I went down there only a few times. I had some mobility problems at the time, so I was dependent on others to get there. But I talked to a number of Christians who went down to support the Freedom Convoy that the truckers brought to Ottawa. And the media was reporting all kinds of propaganda and outright lies about what was going on down there. Non-Christian people that I talked to who went down there, they said, like, dangerous, like it's like Woodstock. It's like peace and love. There was like total strangers walking up to each other and hugging and kissing each other. And yeah, no one was wearing masks. And there wasn't any big uptick in people, dying from being exposed to COVID. And like, how could people say this? And the bouncy castles. I was playing street hockey with some kids who were maybe in like 12 years old or so. Best fun I'd had in years. And I'm thinking, like, how can they say it's dangerous here? Like, this doesn't make any sense. And one night I was down there, and it was quite a cold night. I'd been there for a while, and got chatting with someone. He said, "Oh, I know some people. They've got an RV just short ways down the street here." He said, "Come on, you can go inside and get warmed up." So I went in and sat down. There was maybe at the most 6 to 8 people in there, and I sat down next to this man, and he starts giving mini sermons, and then we chatted in between his mini sermons, and then he said, "Oh, Gary, can you pray for us all?" Okay, so yeah, he did like 3 or 4 mini sermons, and after each one was done, he'd ask me to pray. Well, another few days later, I went down, and I was by the War Memorial, and I think it was 1 or 2 days before that we had witnessed the police on horseback who trampled the what was she, a Mohawk elder? I'm not sure if I got the right tribe, but she was in a walker and they trampled her. And around about the same time, Alexa Lavoie, who is a reporter for Rebel News, who had been writing some articles making our prime minister look bad, she was targeted. The police surrounded her and beat her with truncheons. They're like 3 or 4 feet long, and they're like as thick as your arm. They beat her with them. They were hitting her in the chest, and she screamed in agony. I've watched the video, and it's like every time she screamed, I groaned inwardly. I feel so much, compassion for her. And then they took a tear gas gun and point blank range pointed it at her thigh and fired it. And oh wow, she really screamed for that one. And this happened about a day or two before I was down there by the War Memorial. And there was a big line of police with their helmets and shields on and their truncheons in their hand. And I'm looking around and I'm thinking, violence could break out like just happened a day or two before. And I was maybe about 15, 20 feet away from the line of police. And I thought, I got to pray. So I started praying in a very loud voice so that a lot of people could hear me. So I prayed for, I don't know, a minute or two or three. I can't remember how long, at least a minute. Next thing I know, the man standing next to me starts preaching a sermon. And like, okay, like, and well, later I talked to a number of the Christians I know who went down there, and every one of them said, whenever I went down to the convoy, I felt the presence of the Holy Spirit. And I said, yes, I did too. There was a sense of peace and calm. Meanwhile, oh, it's so dangerous down there. I met a young Iranian woman. She was 30 years old, and she lived fairly close to downtown. She worked downtown, and she would go down there at night because she loved the horns. She loved the whole she wasn't complaining about, oh, it's so frightening down there. And one conservative senator, a woman, said that she never felt so safe at night walking out in front of Parliament as she did when the convoy was there.
Yeah. I've heard
And
these accounts from people who live in Ottawa. I hear the same account again and again, that the city has never been so safe, so alive, and so much an outpouring of love.
yeah,
And it was a beautiful experience. I wish I could have experienced it myself. I
yeah,
didn't visit, but I think you're very fortunate to have
yeah,
experienced that. But this is what happened in Ottawa should be happening on a regular basis, in our communities, where people are standing up, standing for what is true, what is right, in a very public manner.
yes,
But there is nothing. Like, I'm thinking, if I were a head of a church, I would maybe even consider holding my services in public parks.
yeah,
And okay, the church is closed, so let's gather in a park, and everyone gather and conduct the service in a public area.
yeah,
But there's a cowardice where
yes,
all of the Christians who are awake are keeping a low profile, but the vast majority of Christians aren't awake. They don't have
yeah,
a clue what's going on here. They're double, triple, quadruple jabbed. But for those who are awake, they're keeping a very low profile, as though they're terrified to stick their head above the parapet.
yeah.
And I feel puzzled, because I keep thinking the Bible is full of characters who were brave and bold and were persecuted.
Well, look at the
But
early church.
mhm,
The early church. You don't sprinkle a little of incense for Caesar. Well, yeah, that's just not acceptable. And Christians refused to do that, and they were martyred. They were sent to the Colosseum, fed to the lions. That was a political act on the part of Christians in the early church. They weren't, it was like wearing a mask or getting jabbed. It was
mhm,
like, no, I'm not going to get a mask or get jabbed, or no, I'm not going to sprinkle some incense for Caesar. That's a political act.
yeah.
And where are the Christians today?
Where are it? And yet there's clearly a revival. I find that in conversation with people, everyone wants to talk about faith and God and the state of affairs. So I think
Mm,
there is a revival, but the irony is that the people who are most excited about their faith right now are not experienced Christians. Do you know what I
yeah,
mean? Like, they're new to the faith, and they're being the ones that are most outspoken and most bold in their faith. And all of the veteran, I call them the veteran Christians, are silent or asleep. I just, I don't understand. I feel so confused about the state of affairs right now, but it's heartbreaking as well.
yes. I'd say that those people that went down to the convoy, they were the ones that were out there speaking out. And I met a young French woman, and she was coming up from Montreal every weekend, and she was telling me that the way I noticed her, she had us holding up a sign that had Jesus on it. So I got to talk to this woman, and she was telling me about preaching to people there, and she said that they had a hotel room, and they ordered out some pizza, and there were some people there that were, sort of open. And this one young man decided that he wanted to become a Christian, and they baptized him in the bathtub in the hotel room. and one woman I know, and I heard this story from more than one person, said that she was talking to a man who said that he saw an angel down there, and the angel was very large, I guess, and he said to the angel, "Why aren't you doing anything?" And the angel replied, "It isn't time." More than one person has told me that story. So I believe God is at work in ways that we're not seeing, perhaps. Yeah. But
he definitely is at work, but this is one of the biggest surprises for me. I feel as though in some ways he has put everyone on an equal footing. It doesn't matter what your religious background. If you were searching right now, you will find him, and you will be bold and you will be brave. It does not matter if you've spent the last 40, 50 years in a church. That's irrelevant right now.
Yeah, yes. Well, have you noticed recently, all the pride things, like for Pride Month, that Muslims and Christians have been working together, and there are Muslims speaking out about this. And I was watching a video a week or so ago. I only watched a portion of it. It was, I think, 24 minutes long, and it was on Parliament Hill, and it was, I think, led by Muslims. But this Muslim man was speaking, but he said, we have our Christian friends are here supporting us today too. Yes. Muslims and Christians working together, he said.
Which I find that very interesting. That's another surprise, that those of true faith right now are finding comrades in other faiths, but not amongst their own amongst their own tribe. There's nothing. There's a void.
Yeah.
So it's all very confusing. So what do you make of that? That Christians and Muslims are united against the evil of today? What?
Well, I think for a long time, Muslims were being told, I mean, they come here and the bureaucracy is full of leftists, and they tell them, "Oh, conservatives bad, they're racist. You stay away from them. Like, don't vote for conservatives and have nothing to do with them because they're bad people." Well, the problem is, Muslims have their ideas on sexuality are very different, and they're having all this stuff shoved down their throats in the schools. And finally, they've said, "Okay, and we can't abide by this, and we're not going to tolerate it." And I think that the Muslims are starting to see that conservatives and Christian conservatives are on the same page, and they're realizing, okay, we've been voting for Liberals, maybe NDP for a long time, but maybe we need to rethink what we're doing. I don't know. I'm sort of out of the loop, maybe to some degree. I don't have the contacts I used to have when I was working, but there's just this growing awareness that evil is afoot. I used to joke to one of my colleagues, evil may be afoot, but mayhem is the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
This is what we're at. We've gone through.
And everyone is seeing it. I know I was just in England, and I was in the back of countless Ubers, and the Uber drivers were from every corner of the world, all with different religions. And they all said to me, "We're in a spiritual battle." So there is that heightened awareness that we're in a spiritual battle right now, first and foremost, but everyone has their different religion to explain what it is that we are witnessing right now.
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting that there's that unity around the world. And it's hard to process what exactly is going on. How is God going to reveal himself in this most unusual period of time?
Yeah. I met a Polish woman at the truckers convoy, and she told me that She lived under communism in Poland, and she said what Canada's like now is far worse than it ever was when she lived under communism in Poland.
Oh my goodness. That's fascinating.
And I've
So,
read about Cubans who have come here, and they're saying, guys, like, open your eyes. Like, this is what Cuba is like. So there are people who have come from oppressive backgrounds, and it's yeah, they see what's going on because they've lived under oppression. They came here to get away from it, and now
yeah,
they're seeing the exact same oppression going on that they ran away from.
exactly. And they recognize the evil because they have experienced it, like you say. So they have a
Yeah,
heightened awareness. So
yeah.
you, what is your take on that recent ruling in Manitoba that backed up the government decision to close the churches? It appears that the church lost in that battle, and the irony was that Costco was open, strip joints were open, liquor stores were open, and cannabis stores, but the churches were closed to flatten the curve.
Yeah.
The
Well,
logic of that decision just makes no sense whatsoever. What do you make of that?
it's what was is a German uh, going back to I can't think of his name, Italian communist. Might have been sort of the impetus for the idea, but it was Rudi Deutschke, perhaps, German activist. I think he came up with the term "the long march through the institutions," and so it's a bit like Fabian socialism in Britain in at the turn of the 20th century. Like, we won't have a violent revolution. We'll just gradually infiltrate everything that's going on. Well, that's what we're seeing. And our legal institutions, the courts, even the police, everything has been infiltrated by people on the left wing of the political spectrum who think that they're ushering in the coming utopia. And what we're seeing is the rule of law has become, it's just slowly disappearing.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I
And
have a book, The Most Dangerous Branch. I can't remember the author's name. It's a Canadian. And probably 20 years ago now, this book came out, and he was talking about the Supreme Court of Canada and how Trudeau's Charter of Rights and Freedoms undermined the supremacy of Parliament, and so handed over authority to 9 Supreme Court justices who are unelected. And the whole judicial system is now full of judges who they don't care about rule of law or due process. Their concern is ushering in the coming utopia. So they make decisions based on their ideology. And surprisingly, in this book, The Most Dangerous Branch, apparently Pierre Trudeau himself made a comment about how after the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that the Supreme Court justices would make a decision, but it obviously was not based on precedent. But Pierre Trudeau himself said they gave a fig leaf of legality to it. They tried to use some words that would make it appear as though they're following the rule of law, but they're not. And
yeah,
that's what's influencing our entire judicial system now is judges and Supreme Court justices as well, who they're advancing their agenda, and the whole idea that we have rule of law and due process, it's water under the bridge. It's gone now.
yeah.
And you are kind of, I think there's still some remnants of it left. There may be some decisions that are okay. That we can look at the, okay, judicial rule of law was, it is followed. I'm thinking of the Liberty Coalition of Canada, which I think formed maybe a couple of years ago, maybe probably during the lockdowns, and group of mostly pastors from Ontario. Maybe they're not all from Ontario, but they started to organize, and they have been defending Christians. They have a lawyer, James Kitchen, I think is his name, who has been helping to defend people, and it's they're all funded on donations. But there's a nurse in Ontario that she refused to get the jab, and she cited her beliefs as a Christian why she could not do this. So she got fired. And so that, I think, is still going through the courts, perhaps. And there have been some other cases that they've been supporting. I think they've been supporting Josh Alexander, the student from Renfrew
Yes.
out in Ontario, and who had some female friends come to him, and with these transgender, gender neutral washrooms, they said, "I'm afraid to go into the girls' washroom because there's guys in there." And so they confided in him. So he stood up for them. And so what happened? He got kicked out of the school. And then, to make sure that the message is getting through, both his parents are teachers, and both his parents have been suspended.
Yeah.
Even though they didn't say or do anything, they just said, "Hey, we raised our child to think for himself."
Exactly.
And so now they've targeted the parents. And so it's become a system-wide thing where it's not based on common sense or logic and reason, because with the whole cultural Marxist thing, if you use logic and reason, you're a white supremacist. And we can't look at our legal system the way we used to. It's being corrupted deliberately by the left, because they're opposed to Western civilization. Now, I think I might have told you about this, an American that I've been listening to. He's a Christian. He has a podcast called Conversations That Matter. And I've listened to a number of his podcasts over the last few months. And recently, you're familiar with James Lindsay?
I'm not. No.
Okay, you need to check him out. He is an atheist. I first heard about him maybe a year or two ago. A Christian friend of mine.
Does he write with the Epoch Times? Or
He
no,
may.
no.
I think
I'm thinking of yeah. Sorry.
He may have been interviewed by the Epoch Times, but this guy's an atheist. But he was discovering that even he was getting shut down. He couldn't voice his own opinions. And my first encounter with him was a friend, a Christian friend, sent me some videos. And one of them, he and Peter Boghossian, the two of them, a few years ago, achieved some notoriety because they made up some bogus articles and submitted them to peer-reviewed journals, and they were completely bogus. And they got published. And it was like utter nonsense. And they were just testing to see, like, how far does the craziness go? And someone figured out what was going on and exposed them. But they proved their point. But these two guys, and there was a woman, I can't think of her name right now, but these two guys, Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay, were talking to Michael O'Fallon, who I think is a Southern Baptist, and they were warning him that critical theory is going to the Southern Baptist Convention. They're trying to use cultural Marxism as a tool for understanding the world, and that we can use this as Christians. And they were warning him, you have to do something about this. The Southern Baptists are threatened by this. Imagine a couple of atheists talking to a Southern Baptist saying, hey, we're very concerned. You need to do something. Like, your church is threatened. Atheists concerned about the Christian church? Well, the mind boggled.
If the mind is boggled. So what if God were with us right now? What do you think he would say to people? If he could speak directly to people, what do you think the message would be?
I don't know if I want to presume to speak for God, but I don't know. We can look at the word of God, and I keep going back to, we're to be the salt and light of the earth. Oh, what does that mean? We should speak out about injustice. And I think we're seeing lots of injustice, and God hates injustice. Now, this doesn't mean that we as Christians can set up some kind of theocracy, but I don't think it means to sit and, well, there's evil going on over there, and like I'm just going to focus on myself. Oh, sure, I'll pray about this, but that's all I'm going to do. And I want to look up this thing that I had sent you. There's this video, uh, and it's called Cages: Human Trafficking Truth. And someone who was involved with this said this: "As a chat member is getting pushback from many people when asking them to view the human trafficking documentary Cages. So they asked my advice on how to respond. Below are the excuses and my suggested responses." So he said, here's the first excuse: "I don't want to hear about this. It's ruining my day and makes me feel horrible." Well, this is about children mostly, the
Yeah.
human trafficking. And the second response was, "As Christians, all we have to do is pray and give it to God." Well, this is that mentality, the pietism thing where, oh, we don't get involved in politics, but yes, we can pray about this. Well, this is someone who's saying, no, we shouldn't speak out, but just, go in your prayer closet and pray about this, and that's all you have to do. I don't think so. What would William Wilberforce? The back in the 19th century, people would go, "What would Jesus do?" Well, we could also say, "Well, what did William Wilberforce and Dietrich Bonhoeffer do?" Now, the response that the guy who was posting this had to those excuses was, number one, why would you make human trafficking about you and your feelings? Are you saying it's okay for people to go through this because exposing it makes you uncomfortable? First response. And then he gives here's a lot of Bible verses that say we need to get involved, not just pray. So he gives a link there, and I haven't looked at the verses. So he's saying, the Bible tells us we need to get involved. And
Yeah. And actually, I think the next reality is you will probably be persecuted. And if you're
yes,
not being persecuted, what are you doing? If you're not taking a stand in a public way and being actively persecuted right now, then maybe you need to reevaluate what you are actually doing. Because it's so easy to go in our little cubby and pray.
yes,
That's safe. But it's not safe to stand up, to attend rallies, to speak out publicly, to really push up against this dark agenda. It's not safe. We're exposing ourselves to ridicule, to discrimination. Uh, but it's like stand up and be counted, is what I feel like saying. But there's so many so many Christians that don't even see we have an issue right now. Those people are
yes.
asleep and there's nothing we can do. But the people who are awake, the Christians who are awake, there's never been a better time than now to stand up, I would say.
No. And part of the problem is people are still watching the CBC and CTV news on TV. You're not going
Yes,
to, yeah,
not recognizing that that's 100% propaganda. It's a complete and utter waste of time. Yeah.
yes,
Well, anyone that is watching the mainstream news at this point does not get the plot, because if you watch that, like us, it's too frustrating. It's like, who wants to watch propaganda? It's not real news, it's not authentic, it's not accurate. So I don't know anyone who is aware and awake who still reads or watches mainstream news, except to dip in occasionally to see what they're up to. But on a regular diet of mainstream news right now is an utter waste of time, I
yep.
think. Yeah.
Oh, 2 decades ago, I stopped watching that. 2 decades ago, I said, this is just nonsense. It's propaganda. I don't believe anything they say. And
You were way ahead of the curve, though. I was reading The Economist and reading the Globe Mail, National Post, New York Times until about 3 years ago. And then the onset of COVID, I thought, wait a minute, and everything, you know,
yeah,
dissolved at
well,
that point. But you're way ahead. But
yeah, I
it's
still, sorry, I still read the National Post, and sometimes there's some good stuff in there, but
yeah.
I've noticed that the best writers at the National Post are now writing for the Epoch Times. which when I first started reading the Epoch Times or Epoch Times, however you say want to say that, it was free.
Yeah.
You had to go and get it from a box on the sidewalk somewhere, and it was considered fringe. Oh, there's a bunch of crazy loonies. They're Falun Gong, and the leader of Falun Gong is some whacked out, a religious nut, and they're all been brainwashed. Well, they do support this Falun Gong thing, which I, as a Christian, do not. But I could see that they're trying to do real objective journalism.
Yeah.
And I was actually corresponding with one of their senior guys for several years, but last 2 or 3 years, our contact has been diminished because they've become so successful and so busy. There's no time to deal with me anymore, but I've watched them grow and they become a major outlet. But I also started looking, really about a year or two ago, started looking, where am I going to get any news? And so, I'm looking at the alternative media, and there's so much out there that you and I are aware of because we're not looking at the mainstream media or the legacy media. I talked to a guy one time, and I said that term mainstream media. He says, "I don't like that term." Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't
Well,
accept the use of that term.
yeah, let's call it legacy. It's certainly, there's no question who owns it and
Yep.
what their agenda is. So it's a pointless exercise to engage with it. But no, there is a lot of good alternative media, and the alternative media is growing very quickly.
Yes.
So who are your favorite sources? I like the Western Standard for some things.
I will look
Uh,
at that for some things.
yeah, I
True
used to
North.
like True North. I used to like Al Jazeera, but they seem to have disappeared. Um, they had some big explosion, I think, in their headquarters, and I'm not
Yeah.
seeing anything from Al Jazeera anymore. But
Yeah.
even Russian Times actually
Yes.
has.
Yes.
I
I've seen
write
some great stuff there.
there's been some good writing. I don't like all of it, but certainly there's some pretty objective writing there. Um,
Yes. Rebel
but
News.
some Rebel News, yeah.
Some people object to their style. Uh, doesn't their style doesn't suit some people, but but they're reporting on things
Yeah.
that you're just not going to hear about elsewhere.
No, who is really fabulous is in England is the UK column. They do
Yeah.
fabulous reporting, but it is more UK based. And the Conservative Woman, even GB News and people like Mark Stein, mind you, I don't think Mark Stein is with GB News anymore, but
He
there
used to
are
write for the National Post.
Mark Stein.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. Years
well,
ago. I loved him.
I love him too. He's vaccine injured and angry. He's had, I think, a heart attack since his vaccine, and
Yeah.
he is mad, which is
I
sometimes when people get mobilized when they're angry. So Mark,
yeah.
I like Mark Stein too.
I love Neil Oliver.
Oh yes, he's
That
very good.
well, I he's got a wee bit of a Scottish accent. I
Yes, yes.
It's like,
But
with my Scottish heritage, I'm a little partial, a little biased maybe, but
yeah,
but
yeah.
but it's just the Scottish accent, I think, really helps a lot. But he just has all these words of wisdom. When I first saw him, I thought he looks familiar. I didn't realize for a while that, I used to see him on TVO, and he was with BBC, and he did these travelogues. He'd go around the coast of Britain, and he was doing all this history stuff. And I think he's an archaeologist or something like that.
Yes, yes.
But then I started to see him doing these political things, and I'm thinking he looks familiar. But then I started paying more attention. It's like, oh wow, it's like the voice of wisdom,
Oh, he was actually the master of ceremonies at the World Council of Health in Bath earlier this month. So I actually got to meet him. He's the real deal. I really like him. You know who else is very good is Bright Light News with Glenn Young. He is a former teacher who broke off during COVID to start reporting things. He's a one-man show, but does excellent reporting. So there are some good sources out there, but we have to hunt them. We definitely
Yes.
need to. Now I want to ask you: have you been listening to Mario or Archbishop Mario Vigano? Do you ever
I've
listen
a
to
little
him?
bit, yes. Yeah, actually,
He's put out a recent statement, really, almost like a call or a plea for action by
yes,
people to stand up now and take, oppose what is going on. I found
yes.
that to be very, very riveting. Um,
I first encountered him probably at least a year ago, maybe longer. It was something much more lengthy than what I saw recently, and
mhm,
I was like, "Hey, I like this guy.
yeah.
He
Well, in the
he sees
Catholic
what's going."
Church, he's
Yeah.
one of the only archbishops that I know of who's speaking out.
Speaking of the Catholic Church, I finally remembered what I was going to say earlier: liberation theology,
What do you mean?
and yeah, liberation theology. This was the the Soviet Union infiltrating the Catholic Church, and I think it was in Venezuela, and it spread from there throughout Latin America. Say Christ with an AK-47, but I think that the current Pope Francis was advocating liberation theology because I think he went to this seminary. I think in Venezuela. I think that's where he got his training. So
Yeah, he's a Jesuit apparently,
yeah, it
and
is the Jesuit.
he's very dark. By the way, have you heard about the new Bible that is being written as kind of the one world under the UN and the one world governance? There's apparently a Bible that's been created that the Pope has endorsed. Are you familiar
I
with that?
I think I
I
might have
can't
heard some.
remember. Yeah, I
I
can't
think I
think of
might
the
have heard
name of
some
it.
hint about that,
Mhm,
but I don't know any details.
mhm.
Well, I know that
Reimagined.
the Chinese Communist Party has been rewriting the Bible.
Oh dear.
So yes, so to make it amenable to communism, to
Oh
Chinese
dear.
communism with Chinese characteristics.
So what, Gary Craigs, what would you say as kind of your final uh, statement to people? What do you feel that is the most important message that you would like to impart?
Avoid cowardice. We need, as Christians, to stand up for what we profess to believe. And I think I can look at myself and say the very same thing. Now that I'm retired, I'm not in a situation where, let's say I might lose my job. So it's perhaps less dangerous for me. But so I wonder, like, wow, if I get shoved into a situation, will I have the courage of my convictions? So I'm saying this to myself as much as to anybody else.
Mhm.
But we need to have courage. But uh, in terms of the church, like, how much do I just keep my head down amongst the Christians that I know are not awake? Do I need to be, speaking out and saying, hey, like, don't you know that there's something going on out there? And I talked to a Christian woman a couple months ago, and somehow our conversation moved towards discussing supply chain problems. And I said, I think this was planned, it's deliberate. And the response I got was, that's a conversation we don't need to have.
That's the
Okay.
conversation that we absolutely need to have. So my very last question is, what give me your prediction of what's coming down the pipe here and your best
Well,
guesstimate of timelines maybe.
well, boy, that's a tough question.
Mhm.
Um, I have to say that I've seen this coming for decades. I've been greatly influenced by the writings of Francis Schaeffer, who died in 1984. It was I was raised at a Baptist church, but I became a Christian. I ran away for a few years. God caught up with me. Uh, and the church I started going to when I became a Christian, they were well, we watched a video series that it was based on one of Schaeffer's books, How Should We Then Live? Schaeffer warned us in this video what was coming down. Like you can find it online on YouTube. How Should We Then Live? Francis Schaeffer, and I think it's broken up into 10 episodes, each one about half an hour in length. And I think in the last episode 10 that he talks about what's going to happen. He talks about the TV news being propaganda. Schaeffer saw this coming. He spent 4 decades of his life studying Western civilization through a biblical lens, and he told us this is coming. So I've been prepared. Like it was what 1982 I became a Christian, and shortly after that I started reading Schaeffer, and we actually you know, watch this video series in a Sunday school class. And so I've got his complete works, his 5 volumes, 22 books. I saw this coming a long time ago, and I was trying to tell other Christians, but
you're way ahead of the curve, but where do you see this going? If you were to guess what's coming down the pipe here and how quickly?
let's say I'm surprised at how rapidly things have changed in the last 3 or 4 years, but I don't know. That's a tough one to answer. Um, you know,
Well, do you think,
back,
for example, like the 2030 UN agenda is a culmination of this very dark agenda where the dark side would like a one world government? And we know that they're really pitching for 2030 to be the beginning of that.
yeah,
Do you
I,
think that
I
they'll
think
achieve that?
I think that if the church doesn't wake up and start doing something, praying about this, it could happen even sooner, perhaps. Although, no matter what you think of Donald Trump, he was an aberration. He wasn't supposed to happen, from what I've been seeing from the people that are advocating the Agenda 2030 stuff, and that's why he's been so vilified. But that slowed things down from what I've been reading recently. That Trump got in as president, they were trying to advance things sooner, and so that put a pause on things. Can we put another pause? I don't know. Throughout history, there have been Christians who said, "Oh, this is the end of the world." When Napoleon was marching his armies across Europe, there were Christians who were like selling everything they owned, camping out on the mountainside, and saying, "Okay, we're waiting for the imminent return of Christ." The premillennialists among the Christians. Well, that never happened, and I'm very reluctant to answer your question for that
Yeah,
reason.
yeah. Oh,
Christians have made it.
do you think that we're in the end times?
I think that we must be in the lead up to the end times. Are you familiar with Amir Sarfati? He's an Israeli Jew who lives in Israel, and he became a Christian. And he is very much in the premillennial camp and believes that we are very close to the end times. He's written quite a few books. He has his own Telegram channel, and I don't know what other platforms he's on. He has a thing called Behold Israel. But Amir, Amir Sarfati, like the Russians are, Tsarfati. Look up Amir Sarfati, and he is very active. He travels around the world, and he talks about all these things, and he talks about the book of Ezekiel, and how it's like we are seeing the signs, and I think he's right. Can things turn around? I say Trump was this aberration that the globalists didn't count on. He was standing, although some things Trump did kind of seem to go along.
Yes, I don't trust Trump either. Apparently, he is a Freemason. Apparently, so I don't think any one person's going to save us. But
No,
he may have been a fly in the ointment. But I don't trust him. But
well, it's like
it does feel as though a lot of the writings in Revelation are coming to fruition right now.
that's my sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
I say we
it's
don't want to make fools of ourselves and pick a date, because we're told in the word that only the Father knows, not even the Son knows. So Christ himself doesn't know when it's going to happen. So it'd be very rash as Christians to say, "Oh, it's going to happen," at this point in time. I don't want to go there.
but I would say that we would all agree that we're going into a chapter where it feels like Satan is ruling this world. He's the dominant force, and
Yes.
we are, which is is going to be a definite new chapter. There's always been that angst with
Yeah.
Satan,
Well,
the dark
the,
side, but it really feels as though we're going into a very dark chapter.
yeah. Well, the Bible itself tells us that Satan is the ruler of this world, and watch out. The devil is like a roaring lion, prowling around to see who he can devour,
Hmm.
and we're certainly seeing lots of that.
Well, I think
Uh,
because we had a Judeo-Christian country in a sense, and kind of framework for education and judiciary, there was this sense of how would I say, God was very present. But now I'm feeling as though he's been pushed to the side by the
yes.
culture at large, and Satan is ruling this chapter
Yeah.
big time.
Oh, one thing I was going to mention when I was mentioning James Lindsay earlier, uh, he has been promoting the idea that the radical left is attacking Western civilization, and he sees what's happening to the church and Christians, the growing persecution, is just an offshoot of that. But this John Harris guy at Conversations That Matter said, although he's been very helpful, we have to remember that James Lindsay is an atheist and he's got things backwards. And he said that the real problem is the West is founded on Judeo Christian principles. And what we are seeing is not an attack on Western civilization, it's an attack on God and the church. The radical left, motivated by Satan, is attacking God and the church. Western civilization is the sideline. It's only because of the foundation of Western civilization being Judeo-Christian principles
Yeah.
that they're attacking Western civilization. The real target is Christ, God, and the church and Christian believers.
Well, Gary Craigs, I think that's a good place to end. I think you hit the nail on the head. If there's one statement that is the takeaway here, is that our society, which was Judeo-Christian or is under direct attack from Satan. And at this point, we're not winning. And
Yeah.
we better mobilize because it's getting uglier by the day. But well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate your enthusiasm and also your desire to learn. I mean, you're so well read on the subject, and I just really appreciate your insight. So thank you for taking the time to chat with me today and sharing your wealth of knowledge on this topic.
Well, my pleasure. But to be honest, sometimes I feel like, you know, I my knowledge is not as deep as it could be. And one of the things that I've been trying to understand is, why is it that the church is silent? And I still haven't found an answer to that question. I mean, I have some ideas, which I've expressed in our discussion here, but
Mhm.
there are still things that I'm puzzled. Like, why is it not obvious? I mean, it's obvious to you and me, and we both have friends who are on the same page as we are. Like, we get it. Why is it that there are so many in the church who either just don't get it, or they're overtly hostile to the way we think?
Yeah.
I don't get that.
No, it's I'm puzzled as well, and that was the original intention of this conversation today, to kind of unpick that. But I don't know if I have any um, insight on that. It's a
Yeah.
curiosity. Well, it's more than a curiosity. It's a frustration of mine because
Yes, I feel
yeah,
very frustrated, and
I feel,
I
yeah,
I, I think there you have to look to some degree at, there's some bad theology, but as you mentioned, we have to be careful when we discuss that. We don't want to alienate people by saying, "Oh, this is the right theology." I mean, we're sinful human beings, and we don't have all the answers. But
mhm,
I think there's just some bad ideas in it. Um, I think the preaching in the churches has really gone downhill. Uh, across the evangelical church. Not, you can't pick out any denomination because I think it's affected all denominations.
Absolutely.
The quality of preaching. When I was growing up, it seemed like Christians knew much more about the Bible than they do now. So we've got biblical illiteracy, and I think it stems from the pulpits to a large degree.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. Absolutely. It's been, faith or Christianity has been watered down. And like you say, the Christians are not being educated in the way that they were historically. Well, on that cheery note, Gary, we'll say goodbye, and perhaps we'll talk again, but stay strong, and we'll keep praying and acting.
All right.
But thank you. Thank you for
You're
your
welcome.
time.